Polish history is full of heroic stories, dramatic battles, and unforgettable tragedies. But what if some of the most famous stories repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and even political speeches aren't entirely true? Did Polish cavalry really charge tanks with sabers in 1939? Did Poland completely disappear from the map for 123 years? And did one battle near Vienna really save all of Europe? These stories sound powerful, some even inspire national pride. But history is rarely that simple. In this video, the biggest myths about Polish history will be explored, not to tear down the past, but to understand it more clearly. Because the real story of Poland is actually far more fascinating than the legends. And one of these myths, repeated for decades across Europe, started as propaganda during World War II. That story comes later. One of the most repeated claims about Polish history is this: Poland disappeared completely for 123 years. This refers to the Partitions of Poland, when Russia, Prussia and Austria divided the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between them. By 1795, the state was gone from the political map. No king, no parliament, no independent borders. But here's what often gets misunderstood. The Polish nation did not disappear. Polish culture, language, and political life continued, sometimes openly, sometimes underground. In Russian-controlled territory, a semi-autonomous entity called the Congress Kingdom of Poland existed for a time. In Austrian Galicia, cities like Kraków and Lviv became centers of Polish intellectual life. Universities, newspapers, and literature kept the national identity alive. Even abroad, Poles continued fighting for independence. Thousands joined the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte, believing the French emperor might restore a Polish state. And eventually, after World War I, that dream returned. In 1918, Poland reappeared on the map of Europe. So the country lost sovereignty, but the nation never disappeared. That distinction matters, because the survival of Polish identity during those 123 years remains one of the most remarkable cultural resilient stories in European history. And the next myth reveals why that earlier Polish state struggled so much before the partitions happened. For centuries, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the largest states in Europe. At its peak, it stretched from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea. Its political system was unique. Instead of an absolute monarch, the country operated through a parliament called the Sejm. And within that system existed a rule that became legendary: the Libram veto. Under this rule, any single noble could stop legislation and even dissolve the entire parliamentary session. Just one person saying no could halt the government. For many years, this system was celebrated as a symbol of noble freedom. But imagine trying to run a modern country with a parliament where any one member could shut everything down instantly. Eventually, that is exactly what began happening. Foreign powers started bribing nobles to use the veto. Political paralysis became common. Military reforms failed, tax changes stalled, and the central government became weaker and weaker. But here's the important point. The Libram veto did not destroy the Commonwealth on its own. External pressure from rising powers like Russia and Prussia played a huge role. So did economic challenges and internal political divisions. In other words, the collapse of the Commonwealth was not caused by one flawed rule. It was a perfect storm of internal weakness and aggressive neighbors. And one of those neighbors would later play a major role in spreading another myth, one that still appears in history discussions today. Another widely repeated claim describes the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as the most tolerant country in Europe. And compared to much of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, that statement has some truth. Religious wars devastated many parts of the continent. But in 1573, an agreement known as the Warsaw Confederation established protections for religious freedom among the nobility. Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians could coexist within the political system. Jewish communities also found relative safety in the Commonwealth, compared to many Western European states. But the idea of perfect tolerance is still an oversimplification. Over time, Catholic dominance grew stronger, political rights for non-Catholics gradually weakened, religious tensions did appear, especially in later centuries. So the Commonwealth was not a paradise of equality, but for its era, it was unusually pluralistic, and that relative openness helped create the diverse cultural landscape that shaped Polish history for centuries. Yet one of the most famous stories in Polish military history takes place far outside the country's borders, in a battle that many people believe changed the fate of Europe. In 1683, a massive Ottoman army marched toward Vienna. If the city fell, Central Europe could have been exposed to further expansion by the Ottoman Empire. The situation looked desperate. Then a coalition army arrived to relieve the city. Among its leaders was the Polish king John III Sobieski. The decisive clash became known as the Battle of Vienna. Sobieski's forces launched one of the largest cavalry charges in history. The famous winged hussars thundered down the hillside toward Ottoman positions. The attack helped break the siege. Vienna was saved. For centuries afterward, the battle has often been described as the moment Poland saved Europe. But the real story is slightly more complex. The victory involved a multinational alliance, including forces from the Holy Roman Empire and other European states. And the Ottoman decline in the region happened through a longer series of wars. Sobieski's contribution was enormous. But history rarely turns on a single moment. Still, this dramatic victory became one of the most powerful symbols of Polish military legend. And yet, the most famous military myth involving Poland doesn't come from the 1600s. It comes from the chaos of World War II. Ask people outside Poland about the start of World War II and many will repeat the same story. Polish cavalry charged German tanks with sabers. It sounds tragic, almost absurd, and that is exactly why the story spread so easily. But it isn't true. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939 during the invasion of Poland, Polish cavalry units did exist. However, they were not medieval warriors riding blindly into armored vehicles. They were mobile infantry, soldiers who used horses primarily for fast movement. When fighting began, they usually dismounted and fought with rifles, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons. So where did the myth come from? Part of the confusion comes from an incident known as the Battle of Krojanty. Polish cavalry successfully charged German infantry. Afterward, German armored vehicles arrived and forced the Poles to withdraw. Nazi propaganda then presented the scene as a reckless cavalry attacking tanks. Foreign journalists repeated the story. Later, Soviet narratives amplified it to portray Poland as backward and militarily incompetent. In reality, Polish forces resisted one of the most powerful armies in Europe under extremely difficult circumstances. And Polish soldiers continued fighting throughout the war, from Britain to Italy, including the Allied victory at the Battle of Monte Cassino. The myth endured because it was dramatic, but the truth is far more impressive. Historical myths are not always created out of bad intentions. Sometimes they grow from national pride, sometimes from propaganda, sometimes simply because complicated stories get simplified over time. Polish history is filled with extraordinary events, heroic resistance, political experiments, and cultural survival against enormous odds. Understanding the real history does not weaken those stories. It makes them stronger, because the reality is rarely simple, but it is always more interesting. Which of these myths was the most surprising? Are there other historical stories about Poland that deserve a closer look? Share thoughts in the comments. Discussions like that help keep history alive. And if deep dives into Polish history are interesting, Consider liking the video, subscribing to The Poland, and sharing this episode with someone who loves history. More stories from Poland's past are coming soon.